Hello, everybody. This is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine, and this is my conversation with Dean Radin, which appeared in issue number 86 and was recorded on September 19th, 2024. We talked about the far reaches of the science behind the real magic that makes poetry. Are poems a kind of remote viewing? Can they see the future? Why do certain poems resonate in particular? Dean Radin is scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, associated distinguished professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and co-founder and chairman of the biotech company Cognigenics. He earned his MS in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Before joining the IONS research staff in 2001, Radin worked at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He has given over 750 talks and interviews worldwide and is the author or co-author of some 7 patents, 300 scientific and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 9 books, 4 of which have been translated into 15 foreign languages. The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. Find more at his website, deanradin.com. This was a fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. We'll be back next week with a regular episode of the Rattlecast. Probably you and I are the only 2 people who have a suspicion even why we might want to talk as a poetry magazine with a researcher like yourself. And so I thought maybe I'd start out with an anecdote of something, the kind of thing that happens all the time. In poetry, I've been interviewing poets for about 20 years, and they all talk, I noticed really early on, they all talk about the same thing, this sort of meditative state you get in when you're creating art. Elizabeth Bishop called it the self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And Billy Collins, the poet laureate, talked about it like he's always like looking around and sniffing at little notions to see if there's any poem might flourish or a poem wants to appear. And then he follows it like a bloodhound following a trail to see where the poem wants to go. In that way of like giving poetry itself, the poem itself, like agency, like it's not him, it's him sort of uncovering what something else is trying to say. So there's always this sort of sense of that. And then, and I always say too on these conversations that I think the best book on writing is actually Zen and the Art of Archery. Because it's a guide to entering that state of unself-consciousness where art can happen. So one of the quotes is, the right art is purposeless, aimless. The more obstinately you try to learn to shoot the arrow for the sake of hitting the goal, the less you will succeed in the one and the further the other will recede. What stands in your way is that you have a much too willful will. You think that what you do not do yourself does not happen. And so we always had the sense of like getting lost in the creation of art, whether it's poetry or any other kind of art. And but the strange thing that we haven't talked about before is the way that somehow poetry seems to be able to predict the future or do strange things. So this is the reason why I finally reached out to talk to you. A few weeks ago, my fiancée Katie, who runs our prompt line, so every week on our live show, we at the end we suggest something to write a poem about, and then people have a week to write the poem, and then at the end we share the poems that everybody's written. And her poem for the week ended up, she wrote it the day before the show. So Saturday night, she wrote this poem that happened to be this sort of stunt body double person swinging over a pit of vipers. And it was sort of a strange image, like why write about that? It didn't make any sense. There was nothing that, would have caused her to write in that direction. It's just where her mind wanted to go, where that like bloodhound that you are when you're an artist followed. And so that was a strange moment. And then she had a dream that night where her daughter Charlotte was sort of somewhere she couldn't get to. So she kept trying to get to her daughter, and she was like in the distance, and like she had to go around a bend, and then she was gone. So she's kind of like following, and she noted when she woke up that's really strange because I never dream just about my daughter Charlotte. I usually dream about both daughters at the same time, and it felt like odd at the time. And so then we woke up, we went for a bicycle ride around town, and her daughters were with their father at a park nearby. And she kept saying, like, oh, maybe we should try to get to that park and on the bike, because there's all these trails where we live, and we didn't really know how to get there, so we sort of tried. We couldn't really find it. We kept, the tail kept swerving away and going different directions, so we never actually got there. And then we got home. Katie had a text from her husband that her daughter Charlotte, who's 4 years old, was bitten by a copperhead. And so he was at the emergency room. And so this poem... And so we went to the emergency room, talked to the snake expert, and he said, I can't tell what kind of snake it actually is. Probably a copperhead, but it's some kind of pit viper. And he used that phrase, pit viper. The night before, she wrote a poem swinging over a pit vipers, and then trying to get to that place. And this thing seems like it's like a one-off, but it happens so often, you know? The whole series where we share poems where people write almost becomes like what part of our week will someone randomly write about, you know? So like, just for one example, there's just every week it happens where there's things like this. But we were we went to the Desert X exhibit in Southern California. In one of the exhibits, you had to hike up to this sort of field, and then there were these mechanical bulls in the field, as if they were like real bulls, and that was like the art exhibit, still sort of moving around, bucking, but they were just mechanical bulls. And then we got back a few days later, didn't like post about it, share about it, no one knew we were there or what it was. And one of the poems someone read was about riding a mechanical bull, you know? And that kind of thing just happens so much that it's sort of spooky, and you don't really know what to make of it, and you kind of put that aside. But it happens over and over and over again, and I could cite 1,000 examples. So that's what we want to talk about. But to lay the groundwork for that, can you tell us about how you got into investigating these kind of phenomena? Because you have a background in electrical engineering, you worked at Bell Labs. Can you tell the story about how you ended up studying what you do?
Well, I was a kid at one time and read lots of fairy tales and science fiction and mythology and the amazing stories of masters of the East, things of that sort. And so who wouldn't be interested in that? On the other hand, my dad was a sculptor. That was his job. And my first career track, at least, was a violinist. I was training to be a concert violinist. So in my formative years, I was surrounded by art and music. And what you're describing then about the creative person, my dad used to talk about this all the time, that his hands would take over. Like he'd have a sense of what it was he was going to make, but his hands did it then. So he almost stepped out of the way, and whatever the creative process is takes over. As a classical violinist, there wasn't all that much room for straying from the score. But nevertheless, after you're playing an instrument for 5 or 10 years, it doesn't require much thought anymore. In fact, it doesn't require any thought at all. It's completely on automatic, in which case the act of playing almost becomes a kind of a meditation.
Mm-hmm.
So I look back now and say that I had been meditating daily for somewhere between an hour to 4 hours a day for almost 20 years. And so what does that do to you? Well, it pushes your mind into places that ordinarily probably wouldn't go.
Mm-hmm.
So a combination of the things I had read as a child and my own experience led me into wondering, well, as you described, there are many people who have experiences that could be described as precognition or telepathy or whatever. And you see this in stories, and it saturates our entertainment. Could any of it be real? So also having a scientific interest, early on, I discovered that there was a branch of science that actually addressed the question of, are these things merely coincidences that we just happen to remember? Or are we talking about an actual human experience that is actually quite common, but not often talked about? Because it has a connotation to it, as you just said, spooky.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why is it spooky? I don't view any experience as spooky. Maybe unusual, or it may seem different or strange underneath, but it's not really spooky. So what I discovered that you could apply the tools and techniques of scientific methods to getting at two elements. One is proof-oriented. Do these kinds of experiences that you're talking about, like writing a poem that turns out to be precognitive and is fairly common, not only for creative people, but for everyone, is that a real thing?
Mm-hmm.
And then second, given what science understands about the way that the world works, how do we begin to understand that? So those were the two things that I very early on was just very curious about. And I managed over many years to figure out a way of making that my full-time job. So for about the past 40 years, that's what I've done full-time.
Mm-hmm. And so you were working at I think Bell Labs, right? When you started, you sort of veered off the course of that. and you had your life set out in front of you, and then turned into this deeper investigation, I guess you could say. Was it difficult to do? Because there's so much resistance to these thoughts. I mean, even the people who are listening or reading this now, are very skeptical, and we have a culture where it's very, people are very skeptical of that kind of thing. Was it difficult to make that move?
For me, it wasn't difficult at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was at Bell Labs, I had already been doing experiments in graduate school and continued at Bell Labs. And I convinced myself through the data we were getting in experiments that there really was a there.
Mm-hmm.
And once you see that, you have a choice to make. You can continue making better telephones, which is essentially what Bell Labs is all about. Or you can dive into the great unknown, the leading edge of what is known. And anytime you do that in any branch of science, you're always going to be on the edge of controversy, because almost by definition, it's not just the leading edge, it's the bleeding edge.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really know where you're going. You don't know a lot of it. For me, that both pushed my curiosity and also made it much more exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Because among other things, if I'm doing things that have already been done, I get bored instantly.
Mm-hmm.
So I was always looking for something that would spark creativity and also spark passion about what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the phrases that stuck in my mind early on was the one from Joseph Campbell, who said, when asked what by students often, what should I do? Well, the answer is follow your bliss.
Mm-hmm.
That means figure out what your passion is and do that, and figure out a way to get paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
And so what are some of the things that you've done to try to investigate that using the scientific method and with actual rigor, to try to understand what was going on? What was maybe like the first, I guess, maybe successful experiment that you did with these properties?
Well, the first series of experiments I did while at Bell Labs was motivated by one of the projects that we were interested in there, which was, why do machines fail?
Mm-hmm.
See, my master's degree was in electrical engineering, but my doctorate was in psychology. So I fit within a professional category called human factors, sometimes also engineering psychology, they're more or less the same thing. It's what happens when people are using technology or equipment. And so in the Bell system at the time, and still pretty much today, the way that you connect a phone call from here to anywhere else on the planet in a few seconds goes through a whole series of computers.
Mm-hmm.
It was like kind of like the internet, although it was even before the internet that's how it was all done. And so these computers are really important, because if a computer went down, your call couldn't be connected, that you'd lose something like $1 million a minute, or even more today.
Oh, wow.
In terms
Mm-hmm.
of revenue. So the uptime on the reliability of landlines and now cell phones is extremely high. And the way that happens is that all of the computers and equipment along the way are triply redundant. So something could fail, it still would work. The second thing could fail, it would still work. And then you have the third one. Well, that's why we have 99.9% reliability, but not 100%,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes a triply redundant computer will fail. And then the question is, well, why? Can we fix it so that doesn't happen anymore? So investigations happen, and sometimes they find reasons, and sometimes they don't.
Hmm.
So it was that like last 5 to 10% of the time where we could never find any reason why this thing failed, that became quite interesting. Because at that point already, I'd been reading a lot about the literature and parapsychology, and within that domain, there's the idea that the mind and matter can interact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, I could do experiments to see if that is actually true. So the general easiest way to do that kind of experiment is with a device called a true random number generator, which is there are several different ways of making it, but the easy metaphor is like flipping a coin, and you either get heads or tails. So it's producing bits, and it's called truly random because it's not an algorithm like software, but based on some real physical phenomenon. And in this case, it's called quantum tunneling, which is an effect that you find in semiconductors.
Mm-hmm.
So it's based on what within physics is considered to be fundamentally random. no known reason for why you end up with a 0 or a 1. So that's a very convenient tool then to use where you set up an experiment where a whole series of bits are produced by these devices. And while it's going, you ask somebody to try to influence it to produce more 1 bits or more 0 bits. And you display that on a graph so people can see how well they're doing. So it's a very simple experiment, easy to describe to somebody what to do. If they ask them, well, what's happening? You could go down into the quantum mechanics of semiconductors, but you don't need to. You just say, well, just make that line go up. Don't worry about how it happens. So that's an interaction between mind and matter. That's the kind of experiment I was doing at Bell Labs.
Mm-hmm.
So I did it with myself first, and then I got my colleagues to participate. And then I had one of my buddies who's a statistician who later became the president of the American Statistical Association to help me do the analysis of it. And we ended up with data suggesting, at least statistically showing evidence, that the mind or intention can influence the output of these devices. So then to link it back into why do machines fail, in any kind of technical environment, there's a certain lab lore that comes about. And the lab lore says that if there are certain people who will simply break machines.
Hmm.
And the breaking is related in many cases to that person's anxiety. So if you're rushing to the copy machine because you absolutely need to make a copy right now, the likelihood that it'll fail is higher than if you weren't under time pressure.
Oh, is that an actual study that you did about copy machines?
No, but that's
Okay.
that's the lab lore. That's the
Mm-hmm.
stories that you hear.
Uh-huh.
So in Bell Labs, the story that we saw firsthand was that sometimes we would do a demonstration of a system that we were working on for a visiting dignitary. And there's one guy who was the head of the software development team. And all the pressure was really on him because he was the guy who was in charge of the whole thing. And so what would generally happen is we go in, there's a big fancy machine of some type, and we have the dignitaries come in. And then this guy would press a button to show how it works. And more often than not, he would press a button and nothing would happen. It's not that it would break, it's just that nothing at all would happen. And of course, he got embarrassed and we're all chuckling in the background. And after a while, because I was well aware of this lab lore, I said, well, let's try it next time where he's not here. Somebody else pressed the button.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that, and then it always worked.
Hmm.
So that's where this lore comes about from, that we see people's experiences. And I said, well, maybe it was his anxiety that was actually causing this, because after all, it's not that different than experiments involving these random number generators. So
Mm-hmm.
that's ultimately why I got permission eventually to be able to do these experiments at Bell Labs as a rare but nevertheless real reason why sometimes machines fail.
Mm-hmm.
So now I forgot the original question.
Well, I think we're just interested in hearing that story. So it's just so interesting to have these things, explored with scientific rigor, and that's what you've been doing your entire career. The first time I came across your work, I think, was the Global Consciousness Project, which I just found fascinating around like 2000 or something. And that was where you have these random number generators all over the world, in a network. And then you compare sort of background days to special times where, the whole world is like thinking about the same thing to see if that has any effect on the random output of these. So it's the same kind of thing we're talking about on a small scale of trying to push the line up toward the one, but on a global level. And so what you found in that project is that that actually happens. Can you explain, how with such certainty? Because as I understand it, it worked so well that you've sort of given up the project really because it's just so well confirmed that there's, it's sort of there but not really running, I think, or something, right?
No. So first of all, there's a significant difference between what we would do in a laboratory with an individual and
Mm-hmm.
the Global Consciousness Project. The former involves intention. I ask an individual to do something with some sort of output, and we see whether it changes the behavior of the physical system. The Global Consciousness Project, people don't even know that there is an experiment. There is no intention. It's
Mm-hmm.
looking purely at mass attention. And so the way that it works was we set it up so that we would had these random generators in major cities around the world, and every second they would produce 200 bits. And every 5 minutes, all of those samples would be sent up to a server, which was at Princeton University for many years. And so that continues. It's still running today. The formal part of the experiment ran until 2015 or 2017, I forget. And the way it works was we have this incoming flood of data all the time. Most of it is not looked at all. It's useful because we then can have a way of checking to see if the network is behaving randomly. So we wait until a large-scale event occurs. So there's two ways it could happen. One is that it could be something like a terrorist attack where we can't plan it, it just happens.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is planned events, like major celebrity funeral or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So once the event is defined, whether it's beforehand or afterwards, that has to be defined first. Then we get the data, we pull the data out from that section, and we analyze it using a pre-planned method of analysis. And so this is very different than the way that is sometimes described, which is kind of close to how you were describing it. It's not that we look at the data and see some kind of strange deviation and then match it to something in the world, because there's something happening in the world all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So to keep it clean, you wait until you define an event, and then you look at the data.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can compare that chunk of data with data before and afterwards to see, well, before that, was it behaving like randomly? Yes. During the event? No. After the event? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you're able to see that there's the equivalent of something like a signal.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it's not exactly a signal, but something like that. You can see a deviation.
Mm-hmm.
So the experiment went on until we had 500 of these formal events defined. At that point, the analysis showed a 7 sigma deviation from chance. And the sigma, it means one standard normal deviant.
Mm-hmm.
And so without going through the statistics, what it means is that by the time we reached 500 formal events, the overall odds against chance of that result was 3 trillion to 1.
Mm-hmm.
That means that during these major worldwide events where a lot of people are paying attention to the same thing at the same time, it is no longer behaving randomly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a worldwide network. So because of the success of that, we began discussing, well, now what? We see a really big event, but a disadvantage of the random number generators that we're using is that they're designed so that they're impervious to everything. Nothing will interfere with them. It's not electromagnetic fields, it's not temperature, it's not a whole bunch of things that would provide a mundane explanation for these results. So we wanted a different kind of random generator where we'd have the possibility of reverse engineering, well, why do we get these effects?
Mm-hmm.
We dive down into the electronics or the physics or something. So we developed a new kind of random generator which would allow us to do that. And it is now called GCP2.
Mm-hmm.
And the website is gcp2.net. And here, the plan is to get 1,000 of these devices worldwide, which in each device has 4 generators on it. So we will eventually have 4,000 random generators as compared to 75, which is what we had in GCP1. Well, GCP1 will continue to collect data just because it's useful to have these very long data sets. GCP2 has been running for about a year now. And if you go to gcp2.net, you can see the ongoing live results. And eventually that will have much, much more data in it. So in addition, GCP2 will have another feature where we also keep track of worldwide sentiment. So these are measures based on what used to be called tweets and social media, and the Fed keeps a sentiment index for financials. So the reason we want to do that is because one of the issues that came up in GCP1 was that surely there's somebody doing something exciting all the time everywhere, lots of groups and things happening. So how come you're picking up that one thing that you specified and not picking up the other things? Well, the answer could be, well, we are picking up the other things. We have a pretty noisy signal. I mean, we're working with pure noise to begin with, and now we have influences potentially from all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So I did an analysis of the data from every single day over 20 years from GCP1 to see, is this actually behaving according to random chance or not?
Mm-hmm.
And you can do this by looking at different timescales. How random is it at different timescales? And what you find is that between 8 and 20 minutes, it is not acting randomly.
Hmm.
Before 8 minutes and after about 20 minutes, yeah, looks completely random.
Hmm.
So the reason we did that is because of this expectation that there are small and large meditation groups and small and large sports groups and just a million different things that could be causing the equivalent of moments of coherence,
Mm-hmm.
mental coherence. And then, so one of the other questions that people often ask is, well, how can you possibly explain why this mass attention effect, whether small or large, why would that do anything to the physical world?
Mm-hmm.
If you take a purely materialistic philosophical perspective, which is generally where science works and where most people operate, whether they know it or not, it gets really, really difficult because
Mm-hmm.
the only thing we can think of is, well, it's some kind of like an electromagnetic effect or something like that. Well, as I said, by design, we excluded electromagnetics as being a viable explanation. So what else is it then? Well, you need to start entertaining philosophies which are more comprehensive than materialism. And so it's important to say here that one of the critiques we get back from our colleagues is that we can't throw away materialism because we'll have to throw away all our textbooks and start over again. And that's not what we're doing. What we're saying is materialism is actually a special case. It's a little like the metaphor between, or the analogy between classical physics and quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
Classical physics used to be thought this accounts for everything in the physical world. Well, now we know that's not true. It's a special case which only takes place in things that are somewhat large, not too large, but somewhat large, somewhat at the everyday time scale and all that. But as soon as you step away from that, you need quantum mechanics or you need relativity.
Mm-hmm.
So materialism is a special case of a larger worldview that accommodates things like consciousness, because consciousness is not accommodated for by materialism. Well, you can do that in many different ways. So one easy way to describe it is with a philosophy called dual aspect monism. And its close cousin is called neutral monism.
Mm-hmm.
So the danger about talking about philosophy for people who are not philosophers is that their brain turns off. And what I'm about to say will become a soporific and you will fall asleep immediately. But if you want to understand then why we see these effects, with mind and matter interacting, the best metaphor to use is a coin. So in a coin, you have heads and tails. If you're spending a lot of time looking at the heads, you'll know a lot about heads. When you start thinking about it, though, that your internal experience, it's as though you're internally looking at tails. And that's just as real as the heads. And so dual aspect monism is saying that heads and tails on a coin are all part of one structure. And unless you step back and look at it, you don't realize that it's part of the same thing. It's two aspects of one thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's what dual aspect monism is about. It's saying that there is one thing out there, and occasionally it'll split into aspects that we call mind and matter, or that we see as mind and matter.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, if that metaphor holds, then mind and matter are intimately related to each other. They're correlated in a way where they cannot be extracted because they're part of each other. So if you have the mind side of this coin doing something, the physical side, the other side, is going to have to do something. Well, what would it do? If you have a huge moment of mental coherence with lots and lots of minds, it's a kind of somewhat unusual state of being. That would predict, based on dual aspect monism, that the physical side of the world would also become more coherent
Mm-hmm.
because they're correlated. Well, how do you measure worldwide coherence? You use a system which is perfectly random, and you can predict that during those periods, you would find order beginning to appear in the randomness. Well, that's easy to detect statistically, and that's why we think the GCP works.
And so which kind of events were the most common? Is there a certain pattern as to which types of events had the most effect? You mentioned both terrorist attacks and meditation. Is one of those is more profound, or is it impossible because you can't, one's larger than the other, so you can't really, isolate the variables there?
My colleague Roger Nelson was the prime mover on all of this, and he did do an analysis on the valence of the event, meaning positive or negative. So generally, the negative events attract an enormous amount of attention, but the results that you see are not quite as strong as celebrations, planned celebrations. So these are worldwide meditations, opening ceremony of the Olympics, things that attract an enormous amount of attention, but in a positive valence. So there is some difference, but both of them show effects.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, how much does that have to do with just the dual nature of particles? Is that similar to wave particle duality? Like, it's a particle and a wave at the same time, and the world is sort of both the material thing that we see and some kind of thing analogous to a wave that's our minds somehow, consciousness itself projecting outward onto that space.
Yeah, you can make an analogy. A particle we can see as an objective physical thing, whereas a wave is not physical. It's not even located exactly. And so kind of a metaphor, it's another way of thinking of it is that there's physics on the outside and physics from the inside. So everything, all of our experiences are always being created from the inside. And so if you ask a neuroscientist who thinks about these things, what is the difference between tasting a lemon? You bite into a lemon. The outside, you can trace what's happening from an electrochemical point of view from the moment it hits the tongue all the way up to your experience, but it cannot explain the experience. You look at it from the inside, something happens somewhere in the brain that is giving rise to this experience. But then the question is, well, how? How can a physical thing give rise to a non-physical experience? That is still a major mystery in the neurosciences today. And so some major neuroscientists today are beginning to entertain the idea that, well, maybe consciousness actually is not part of the physical world. It's part of the fabric of reality. It's like the threads that weave together to form a tapestry that we would call reality. But it's different in kind, similar in the way to wave-like versus particle-like.
Yeah, and similar to so much, especially thought in Eastern religions, the idea that all is Maya, it's all illusion, or in Buddhism, other aspects of that. So what is, when we sit down to create a piece of art, a piece of poetry, and we have that experience where we're losing ourselves in it, and we just say, I lost myself in the poem, 8 hours went by, and I didn't even realize, like, that the sort of a time collapsed with that focused attention. You feel like you're not writing it yourself, but it's coming from some other place. I think a lot, too, about the Bible, and how we have this concept that there was God writing through people to write the Bible, What is that place, who is the author of things? Is it the collective? I know you just have to speculate, but is it the collective moving through you, or is the creator of the piece of art, say, are they a medium for something larger, or is it something that we're tapping into, but we're still ourselves, and it's another aspect of ourselves? That's one of the things that we've talked about a lot on here. We talked to Ian McGilchrist about the bicameral nature of the brain, and how he has the master and the emissary concepts, and the left brain is the emissary that sort of has your rigid structures, and then your right brain is a more holistic view of the world, and sees more but doesn't really articulate it and have it in just sort of defined concrete models. And so it's always this interaction between the two. And his idea really is that we're pulling that creativity from that right brain, that's more subconscious, holistic aspect of understanding things, and then finding a way to say it with our right brain, and that it's a merger between the two. But that doesn't explain at all this sort of precognitive, higher level, and it's not just precognitive, but like clairvoyance over space. There's so much to it. What do you feel like, where is it coming from?
Yeah, we don't know.
Hmm.
It's coming from elsewhere. What we can do from a scientific perspective at this point is show that these effects actually are non-local, that it's true that you can get effects through time, you can get effects through space. That's what the data shows, that it is possible to do that. And by the way, usually better performance in experiments with creative people,
Hmm.
partially because they're living in a space where it's not as rigidly bound to
Hmm.
everyday space-time. And so
Yeah.
you see that. It's almost any kind of creative outlet, you'll see better performance, even in laboratory experiments.
Hmm.
Where does the information come from? We don't know.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned different people, and that's something I was wondering about too. Do you think that's sort of inherent to all humans? It's just an aspect of being a human, or being just an animal in this universe, or is it people being artistic? They went in that direction, so they happen to have like trained themselves to be more tuned, or are people more naturally tuned to this? In the same way, psychometric personality traits you develop really early. Can you, if you're not a person that goes in this direction, as an artist or listening for that deeper voice, whatever we're going to call it, do you have a? Can you learn and train yourself to be better at it?
Well, you could ask the same question about poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Can anybody have the capacity to write a poem? Probably. Are some people a lot better than others? Yes. It's the same in music, it's the same in sports, it's the same in every aspect of human performance. Some people are really talented and some people are not. And it's exactly the same here.
Mm-hmm.
So for the people who are, whether they're talented or not, can you be trained? Well, do the same for poetry. Can you be trained with certain techniques to make poetry better if you're a novice? Probably. But you'll reach an asymptote at some point where you're not going to be able to go any further because your talent won't let you. The same is true in this domain. So yes, there are things you can do, anybody can do. Usually meditation and things of that sort can improve these kinds of skills to some extent, but you'll eventually reach an asymptote and you can't go any further than that.
Mm-hmm.
Other people don't need to be trained at all because for whatever reason they arrive with enormous amounts of talent, and those are the people that we call natural psychics. They
Mm-hmm.
can just do it. They don't know how they do it, but they're really good at it. And as best as we can tell, they don't get much better.
Mm-hmm.
They can't train. I mean, if they're already really good, they can't train to become 10 times really good. So
Mm-hmm.
they've kind of reached the asymptote of their talent very quickly, and that's where they are.
Oh, that's interesting. So it could be like there's a level that you can reach, and then it just plateaus. In the same way, like running, you can only run so fast because of, human physiology, and so there's a limit to that in that regard.
Yeah, well, and that's true with any kind of talent.
Mm-hmm.
So like when I started out in the violin, because I was naturally talented on the violin, I didn't really need to practice. I did because I was told to, because I was a kid and I didn't know any better. But I learned pretty quickly where my asymptote was. And I decided then I could make a living doing this, but there's got to be an easier way to make a living than being a musician.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, I was also good in science and math, and I told myself, I can do that because then I would have a job where I can sit down and do stuff with my
Mm-hmm.
mind. And if I want to, then I can play the violin, or I've also learned how to play the banjo. I could do that for fun because among my colleagues who remained in music, after a while, it's not really fun anymore. It's your job. And so, yeah, I decided I didn't want to do that as my job.
Mm-hmm. So what are those things you can do better? I was reading about the remote viewing aspects, which is where, like being given a target and then sort of automatically almost sort of trying to be as unconscious about it as possible, sketching pictures of something until you find, what the target was, is the idea behind remote viewing. And it felt very similar to the process of trying to write a poem or create a piece of art. Is you want to get out of the way. What we said at the very beginning, that much too willful will seems to be what you're trying to turn down. Is that accurate? Is that the main gist of, sort of, just say in remote viewing in particular? If you wanted to become a better remote viewer, what would you do?
Well, the training for remote viewing, which is just clairvoyance, is to learn how to gain an impression without naming it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're so word oriented, especially in poetry or any kind of writing where everything is about the words. But before you get to that in remote viewing, it's as though the information is there. It doesn't, you don't have to grunt and groan and meditate for an hour and a half. It's like there instantly, the moment that you apply your mind to a distant target in space or time, the answer is right there.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that we tend to name things immediately because that's what we're used to doing. So if I had a target in an envelope and put it 20 miles away, and your task is, I will tell you that in an hour from now, I'm going to give you that envelope and you can open it and you'll see it. Tell me now what's in there. So it's not exactly precognitive. It sort of is, and that it really is 10 miles away in an envelope, but you will also see it in an hour from now. So if you do that task, you might have like a flash of yellow color, like a sweep of yellow.
Mm-hmm.
And almost instantly, most people will say, well, it's either a banana or an umbrella
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. That immediately constrains what it is that you're able to see. And it's then very, very difficult to imagine anything else because you'll start projecting that into the imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole training procedure then is to say, don't name it. You'll probably still say banana. So in many of the training methods, you write down the word banana, you put a circle around it, and you say, okay, I'm going to set that aside. And then you go back to it, whatever that impression was, and say, well, what else can I perceive that I didn't see before because I was distracted by bananas? So that's part of the training process where you do that again and again and again. And once you get good at it, an image will begin to form that sometimes is what you originally got, but oftentimes not,
Mm-hmm.
because you're able to kind of wade through all of the naming that goes on and then get an actual picture of what it is, which
Mm-hmm.
might have yellow in it for sure, but it may be something that is not a banana and not an umbrella or anything else like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so interesting to hear that because that is the experience of writing a poem because you're trying to write towards some kind of discovery, and a poem, Frost said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And you have to have that experience of being surprised yourself. And it's so easy along the process. It's like, oh, I'm going to go here. Or especially now, a lot of stuff is politically oriented, and so there's a lot of, I want to make this political statement from the poem. And then you push through to the goal that you had, and there's something that just doesn't work. I don't understand what it is. And when I'm reading submissions, one of the main things we do with this magazine is we get submissions of poetry. We get about 250 people a day send us poems, and
Wow.
we read through all of them and then pick some to publish. And you just kind of flip through, and I always describe it as like turning the dial of a radio station, which is one of the reasons why the Global Consciousness Project is, it's like it's static. And then you hear something within the first line of a poem, which is like a voice that's I feel like it's honesty or something, but it's like a kind of music that's like an authenticity of music. And when you hear that, then when you push through the poem, you realize that it went somewhere. And you can feel like the honesty and the surprise in the writer. I don't know what it is. It's like it's some kind of like there's some kind of antenna we have for that. We talked to James Pennebaker, who wrote the book The Secret Life of Pronouns, about the way the syntax we use is modulated in the Broca's area of the brain, which is like unconscious, and you can kind of tell if somebody's lying or not, through algorithms, not consciously. But a computer can tell if you're lying or not based on the way you're structuring your sentences. There's like an authenticity. So we wonder if maybe it's just that and we're picking up on that. But there's something that it feels like much deeper than that, which is just like one human soul, like speaking clearly without the veil of the illusion or something over the and you hear it, and it's so present, and everybody who edits magazines like this and filters through, you know the poem that's clear as soon as you read it, but you don't know why. There's something to it, and so it just I want to know what you think that is.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. I know what you mean, though, because the same thing is true, of course, when evaluating art and illustrations and so on, that And even people in the movie business know that too.
Hmm.
You take a clip of somebody and you know that they're going to be able to move out through the screen, whereas others are always behind the screen. And of course, in a movie, you want the people who are portrayed on the screen to come out to the audience, because otherwise that's like looking through a window. Well, that's a special skill, and a good director will see it immediately. I don't have that skill. I'm glad that directors do, though, because it makes the viewing enjoyment that much better. But there's something there too.
Hmm.
So what is it? I don't know. As you said, maybe you can start coming up with a list of explanations as to what it is, the way the person looks, how they sound, how they move, all of those kinds of things, and the same then in the words that are being used. A much more speculative sense is that if you are able to connect to the person psychically
Hmm.
by reading what they wrote, because after all, one of the ways of providing a target in some experiments is you have a written description of something, and that's all you have.
Hmm.
Or the way that a medium might work. A medium is told your target is Bob. That's it. And yet Bob is connected to a departed loved one of a client, and you're not even with the client. So you can't, where do you pick up that information from? Somehow people can do that.
Hmm.
So that would require something like a an unconscious psychic sense that you're connecting maybe with the poet directly
Hmm.
when you see that line.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. How it seems to me is that it would be like the writing process itself, because that initial quote we talked about, Elizabeth Bishop said, "The thing that we want from art is the same thing that's necessary for its creation, and that's a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration." So it's that state, that flow state. There's so many ways to describe it, but it feels like when someone has entered that state, you can sort of enter that state too along with them. And so they're sort of connecting with the global consciousness or whatever it is. And then that allows your global consciousness to connect too. And it resonates because you're both connected on some higher level just by the creation of the poem because they connected while they were making it. Do you think that would make sense? Like it's an artifact of an actual, like, authentic connection with consciousness. Whereas most of the time we're living in this world where all our preconceptions are sort of filtering. We have all those heuristic biases that jump in the way and all our preconceived notions about what things should be. And occasionally we get on a deeper level of seeing, like, the real reality behind it. In the way that it's all interconnected. And so if we connect to that and come up with some kind of linguistic artifact of that, then that sort of speaks to the part of us that's going in that direction too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you've created what amounts to an anchor or an antenna into something that somebody else can recognize. And
Hmm.
of course, in your case, if there are poets who are reading other poems, so you're already immersed in the same kind of, to use a bad analogy, like a radio receivers, you're tuned to the same channel. And so if you read a poem by somebody who is getting their inspiration from a certain channel, a poet could probably tune into that a lot easier than somebody who is not a poet.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, this is not a fair experiment, but you get a bunch of poets, you get a bunch of non-poets, and you have them assess the same poems, specifically looking for something like a noetic quality
Hmm.
to some poems,
Hmm.
like ones that speak to you in a deeper way than other poems. You can predict then that the poets will pick it up because they're attuned to that, whereas
Hmm.
the non-poets won't because
Hmm.
they don't know what they're tuned to something else, football or something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's just so interesting. Another thing I want to ask is if are there any studies? We talked about the remote viewing, through visual processing and writing down sketches of what your target is. Are there any similar studies about language itself, about poetry, or any? Is there a kind of, any way to study that you're aware of? Because I haven't come across anything.
Yeah, I don't know about the only thing I can think of that is sort of in that same ballpark, but not about poetry, is about language. And so the experiments I'm thinking of is that some studies looking at clairvoyance about words. So you'd have a word a noun typically, and you put it in an envelope, and then you have a person who is going to try to say something about that word,
Hmm.
maybe tell you about it. So it's somewhere between a remote viewing of a word and precognition in some cases. And so typically the words are in the language that you know. And so there have also been experiments done where it's in a language that you don't know.
Hmm.
And not, I mean, not even like a remote romance language. Like if you didn't know Chinese and you are an English speaking person and you have different words in Chinese and your job is to come up with, well, what does that word mean? Well, some people can do that.
Hmm.
The question is, well, how can they do that? Because they certainly don't know what that language is. They're connecting to some other aspect of what that word means to somebody somewhere. So it's almost as though it's like in the zeitgeist. You can figure out, not not analytically figure out, but figure out through some other connection that this means something like a dog.
Oh, wow. Hmm.
Those kinds of decipherings. So something like that. There have been a few experiments like that, and uh, the results usually are pretty weak. But the
Hmm.
results in all of these experiments are weak, typically. I mean, they're real because you can use statistics to show that they're real, but they're not so strong that people can do it at 100%.
Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Well, that's fascinating. And I think that does maybe that could explain a lot of the ways. If you're picking up on the resonance in the consciousness that somebody created when you're reading a poem that you're tuned to by having practiced reading poems for a long time, that would make a lot of sense. One thing I wanted to ask about too, going back to the sort of precognitive aspects of things, it's happened so many times, but there's no way to know if if it's sort of seeing the future or if it's like calling the future into being. I guess is a sort of a deep question about time and philosophy and what it means. But is your sense, having studied these in so many different ways, that what we're doing is you know I guess affirmations is a better example, because a poem is a kind of mantra, and a mantra comes from the mind tool, is what it means in the Sanskrit, and so it's a tool of something. And you repeat the poem a lot when you're reading the poem. You're giving readings, you're hearing poems, your favorite poems, you read again and again and memorize. And so there's an aspect of that that's like that. That's the affirmational exercise where you're saying, I want this to happen. Every day, every morning, you say, I want to become a millionaire, and then you become a millionaire, or whatever it is. There's a question of, though, are you calling that into being, or are you seeing what's going to become? Is there a sense of if I write a poem that sort of sees the future, which another example for mine that I think of all the time, I wrote this poem 20 years ago. And there was a line that made no sense when I wrote it. I referred to something as back east. And I grew up in New York, and I was on the East Coast at the time. I'd never left. I'd lived the same Rochester, New York, my whole life, and yet I was talking about back east as if I'd been gone, and it made no sense whatsoever. And the details of the poem sort of made no sense whatsoever. But that line stood out. And I was talking about like a train and all this other things going on in this poem, and then 20 years later, sort of the thing that I saw in the poem was there, and I was in California, and so back east made sense, and the whole poem suddenly made sense in a way that never had before. Because we were doing the exact thing I was describing in the poem 20 years before I wrote it. And is your sense more that we're going toward doing that, or did I see the future, or did I like make the future happen by writing the poem? I mean, I don't know what to think about things like that.
Yeah, so I often receive emails from people who are distressed because they had a dream of an airplane crashing and then that day it crashed.
Mm-hmm.
So did they cause the airplane to crash? Probably not. Uh, for a kind of experience that you're talking about, uh, that may have been a combination of both,
Hmm.
right? So, and oftentimes we want to get is it A or is it B? Sometimes you can pretty clearly say it is A or it is B, but when cases oftentimes will become mixed and it's actually a little bit of A and B. And so this question of is precognition a retrocausal effect,
Mm-hmm.
or is it a pushing? Is it a psychokinetic effect? Well, most of my colleagues now believe that it's a combination of both. It really is pushing and pulling. It's so precognition is like from the future looking backwards. Psychokinetic effect is from now looking into the future. It's the same thing. And because it involves causality going in both ways, which, by the way, is okay in physics, quantum mechanics, that's how things happen. Because of that, uh, determining what is causing what probably is related more to how this is not exactly the right words, but you'll get the idea, how much mass is involved. Like if I get the sense that I can mentally make an airplane crash, that's pretty unlikely because while we can do forward pushing psychokinetic effects, they're pretty weak. It would be difficult to make an airplane crash as compared to the next day I'm going to read this thing and be just surprised and amazed that this thing happened. That seems more likely to be an event that rippled backwards in time and you thought about it. So in the laboratory, you can actually do experiments like this, where like the random number generator experiments are oftentimes thought that you're going to push because you're given the instructions now. Make the bits go ones. Well, that's the instruction now. You do that, and then in the future, you see that it happened. But there's another way to do that experiment, and that is we're going to record a whole bunch of bits right now, but we're not going to show it to anybody. Tomorrow, we're going to play the bits back, and then tomorrow give you instructions as to whether to go for 0 bits or 1 bits. So those experiments have been done. They're called retro PK experiments because it's exactly the same as a PK experiment with forward time, except it's done from the future backwards in time. They work the same way. You get the same level of results. And so in one case, we're pushing, in the other case, we're pulling. And whatever is going on with this level of experience, it does not seem to operate in the what we can think of as everyday time, where the arrow of time only goes in one direction. It's as though the arrow can easily move in either direction.
Yeah.
Sometimes both at the same time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Isn't there a version of the double slit experiment that shows retrocausality there in some way?
Delayed choice quantum observer, a delayed choice experiment of any type will do that,
Yeah. When you said separating by distance earlier, you mentioned like 10 miles. Of course, distance is also time because things are bound by the speed of light. Is there any research that suggests that these effects go faster than the speed of light? Like that happening? I mean, there's sort of the quantum entanglement aspect of things would suggest. I mean, that faster than light is possible because of the way two entangled electrons might behave, right? And so is there anything in your studies that show that, like the distance being great enough that it would be faster than light, and so, faster than, or simultaneous,
Yeah. Well, 2 answers. One is that the Earth is not big enough for us to actually test that rigorously. The second is that basically any precognition experiment is already as though, from a spatial perspective, it is way beyond the Earth. Because if you're able to get information from the future, that is faster than the speed of light because it's not here yet. And yet you're still able to get the information.
Yeah. Well, one last thing about, we're living in an age where it feels like things are falling apart. Like institutions are crumbling and, things aren't working as well as they used to. Technology seems to even have plateaued in a strange way. Is something that some people worry about. And is there, and we're also living in an age where there's a lot of misanthropy and there's a lot of like negative feeling. And is there a way that the consciousness that we have, the way it's there's sort of a negative orientation to it in the contemporary zeitgeist, and also that we're sort of more scattered. Like we used to have, religions were governing our thoughts so much. We'd go to church and we'd have these, every Sunday morning. Imagine the difference, when church attendance was extremely high. It was like there was a prayer meditation that you were talking about every Sunday across the whole Western world, and so there's pockets where religion is still big, but religion is fading out everywhere too. Is there a way that like misanthropy and disunity can be causing the sort of chaos that the world feels right now?
Well, at the same time that you may have a certain amount of what we can think of as mental incoherence.
Mm-hmm.
There are also periods which are completely unprecedented in time of periods of mental coherence brought about by instant worldwide media.
Mm-hmm.
So if everybody can enjoy periods where, like the opening ceremony of the Olympics, where we might have 1 billion people all attending the same thing at the same time with positive affect.
Mm-hmm.
They're all enjoying the same show. There's never been a time in history where that was possible. So I think it's not so much that uh, I think the reason why a lot of the apparent disruption is going on now, which is really provincial in time. You go back to the 60s and there were wars all over the place and people thought everything was falling apart then. And you go back not to the Second World War and the First World War and the Civil War and on and on and on. All of history
Mm-hmm.
were periods of complete chaos, followed by, if we're very lucky, around 20 years where things are relatively calm.
Mm-hmm.
We just happen to be in a period where things are not calm right now. So I think it's we have limited history
Mm-hmm.
memories of what's happening. But the other thing that's pushing it, and I think is happening worldwide, is climate change. There are people who would say that there is no climate change. Well, yeah, there is. And so that's causing more migration. It's causing more extreme events, like in was it South Carolina that like 18 inches of rain in one day, called 1,000-year rain.
Mm-hmm.
Not anymore. It's now going to be every year. There's going to be these massive changes. So that is causing a lot of disturbance and fear. And that alone, especially on a wide scale, worldwide, that creates an enormous amount of mental disruption. So will that mental disruption feed back into more physical disruption? Well, if the Global Consciousness Project is correct, the answer is yes, it
Mm-hmm.
will. So that creates a positive feedback loop, which is not so good. How do we fix that? Well, it's not clear that we can.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we go through another period of major chaos,
Mm-hmm.
and then if we're lucky, it calms down, and then everything is fine again for another 50 or 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I guess that suggests though that we can all start with ourselves, and focusing on the self and being through meditation and calmness and writing poetry and making art and playing music, and not focusing on the chaos and the negativity and the fear, then we could be influencing the world in a positive way on that level too.
Yes, I agree. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the segment. Thanks so much for joining us, Dean. It's been really fun talking to you. It's such a fascinating topic, and I really appreciate all the research you do, making actual science out of these concepts that people have trouble believing, but we all experience. It's so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we're told not to believe certain kinds of things that we all experience, which is kind of a schizophrenia state that we're cast into. But yeah, there are taboos of all types, and these kinds of experiences are one of those taboos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. It was great talking to you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.